So Tyson's looking to sell their China poultry business, and there's a pretty good reason why you should freaking care. I mean, could this be the start of the US-China split? Possibly even another Cold War between the Western Allies and the so-called BRICS nations? Well, Tyson Foods certainly is not sticking around to find out.
New tonight, Tyson Foods looking to sell its poultry business in China as the company cuts costs and revamps operations. According to a report by Reuters, this is an all-in effort to return to profitability. Report says that Tyson has hired Goldman Sachs to advise on the sale. Preliminary information has been sent to potential buyers, which was said to include a number of private equity firms.
Did you guys catch that last part? Potential buyers, including a large number of private equity firms, meaning that there are people who want this business. Now, according to one of the people who shared this, Tyson Foods' China poultry business has an annual sales of about $1.1 billion. So the real question is, why sell it, right? Well, the sources who did not say why Tyson was planning to sell the business, they declined to identify because the information was quote unquote confidential. Could they know something that's about to go down in China that we don't know yet? Now, it says here calls for Tyson Foods' China headquarters in Shanghai went unanswered. And just recently, Tyson said that it was evaluating all operations and closing 4 more U.S. chicken plants in their latest bid to reduce costs after its third quarter revenue and profit missed Wall Street expectations. Now, if you guys are not alarmed at this point, you should be. This is after China's meat market has become increasingly challenging with livestock farm margins squeezed in the last 2 years due to weak demand during the C-19 pandemic and increased feed prices because of the Russia-Ukraine war. But really, if you ask me, it really looks like the company's just kind of buckling down and maybe even bracing itself for a global shock that's going to impact everybody. But what do you guys think? Maybe I'm blowing things out of proportion. And it's not just Tyson Foods that seems to be winding down their Chinese businesses. A string of multinational firms have divested from their China businesses or pared their holdings in the last few years as it found it hard to get their desired profits because of the country's slower economic growth and strong local competition or geopolitical headwinds. Foreign companies have also divested a combined $8.5 billion of Chinese assets across all sectors so far this year, following $13.5 billion in disposals in 2022. And on the food industry, the U.S. agricultural giant Cargill, they struck a deal in May to sell its China poultry business to private equity firm DCP Capital for an undisclosed price. British consumer goods maker Reckitt Benckiser in 2021 sold its China infant formula group and nutrition business to an investment firm Primavera Capital Group for an enterprise value of $2.2 billion. Dutch dairy cooperative Friesland Campina, they kicked off a sales of their Frisno infant nutrition brand in December 2021, but as of this recording, they have yet to find a buyer. It sold an infant formula factory in China to a local peer, Inner Mongolia Yili Industrial Group, in July of 2022. Major Chinese feed and meat producer New Hope Lil, they last told investors it was reviewing its businesses and considering bringing strategic investors into its poultry and food businesses in a bid to lower its debt-to-asset ratio. But among all of these, Tyson Foods seems to be the biggest business that could exit China. Tyson Foods is the world's second largest meat producer after Brazil's JBS. They opened their first factory in China in 2001 and now has 4 research and development centers, several processing plants, as well as dozens of breeding farms in the country. It also operates throughout the industry chain in China, from breeding and slaughtering to processing and distribution, providing chicken, beef, pork, and processed foods. The company in June launched a new factory focusing on processed foods such as cooked chicken and pre-made Chinese cuisine in the eastern Chinese city of Nantong, and another one that focuses on frozen and heat processed foods in the central Chinese city of Zhejiang. Tyson Foods reported $39.5 billion in total sales for the 9 months ended July 1st, of which $1.9 billion was from the international and other business segment that includes its China operations. So for them to sell their China poultry business, this means that there is likely some trouble ahead for the region. But what do you guys think? Now, honestly, Smithfield could be going down next. I have people saying that it's time to work on growing and preparing our own food supply. being independent as much as possible. I'm not a prepper myself, but I do think that it doesn't hurt to stock up a bit more than you usually do. You know what I mean? Now, I just heard from Central Missouri, lots of chicken processing plants are closing. News reported up to 8 in different states. People are buying canned white meat chicken in bulk just in case. But what about you guys? Are you guys hearing this kind of thing out where you live? Let me know in the comment section down below. Now, if you haven't yet, you should definitely subscribe to the channel and also turn on that notification bell. That way you don't miss out on any updates like this one that could ultimately affect you and your wallet, not to mention your families. And hey, while you guys are down there, if you don't mind, go ahead and light up the like button for the video. Definitely helps out the channel and it totally makes my day. Appreciate you guys so much for that. Now, I'm not one to draw a pattern here, but I gotta say, not only is it shocking that these things are moving so fast, it's also shocking that the US is seemingly doing nothing at all to combat this stuff. It's almost like key players are hitting for the other team, if you know what I mean. If things continue to go the way that they're going, we may be on our own way to another Cold War. I mean, right now in current news, it's becoming more and more likely that Chinese President Xi Jinping is going to skip the upcoming G20 summit. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, he also confirmed President Biden's visit to India from September 7th through September 10th for the summit. Now, he will also participate in several bilateral meetings with other world leaders during the summit. But President Biden revealed his disappointment, saying that he's disappointed but still sure that he's going to be seeing the Chinese president. The G20 summit scheduled in India was supposed to be an opportunity for the United States and for China to ease their ongoing tensions. The two leaders previously met in person during the last year's G20 summit in Indonesia, but now that might not be the case. You see, Xi is likely to skip the summit, and Chinese Premier Li Qiang is expected to represent Beijing at the meeting in New Delhi. Now, this could be due to a reluctance to give neighboring rival India the spotlight. But then again, tensions are at an all-time high between China and the United States. Now, despite recent visits to China by different U.S. leaders, including Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, U.S.-China tensions are still there over a lot of issues such as technology, espionage, economic competition, military power, and incidents in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. Now, Biden also has been making very strategic moves to counter China's influence in Asia. His plan to visit Vietnam was part of these efforts. They're still trying to de-escalate things, but Janet Yellen's visit to China was seen as a step towards stability. But things are still very uncertain right now, especially with China showing their enthusiasm over their new BRICS alliance instead. US President Joe Biden, he recently brought the leaders of allies Japan and South Korea to Camp David to discuss how to contain China and counter Russia's influence. For example, in Africa's Sahel region, where there was recently a string of coups d'etat. Meanwhile, leaders from BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa gathered in Johannesburg to criticize the West's dominance over the international institutions established after World War II. Now, it's definitely sounding like another Cold War may be brewing for the history books, guys. Though the West's main adversary today, it's China, not the Soviet Union, and of course, the BRICS is definitely no Warsaw Pact. But with the world entering a period of uncertainty, there are parallels in the situations that make history buffs basically speculate on what's coming next. You see, back then, between the end of the World War II and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the two main forces defining the international order were ideological conflict, which split the world into two different camps, and the quest for independence, which led to a lot of different states, from 50 in 1945 to over 150 in 1989 and 1991. Now, these countries were forced either to join a bloc or define themselves as their non-alignment. The US seems to think a similar dynamic may actually dominate this time around. America sees China as probably its first real competitor since the fall of the Soviet Union. So now, our government is using the same strategy as back then. Rally Western allies behind a strategy of decoupling and de-risking, basically an economic version of what they did before, the Cold War policy of containment. Now, on the other side of the world, you got China, which seems to be betting on something like global fragmentation. Yes, they're all about the BRICS nations as an alternative to Western-dominated institutions such as the G7 or the International Monetary Fund. But in China's view, they don't really see things shaking out into the formation of Cold War-style blocs. Instead, China expects a multipolar world. So instead of waging a battle against a US-led bloc, which they'll probably lose, President Xi Jinping is trying a different tactic, establishing a fragmented, multipolar world where China, they're going to take its place as a great power. I mean, even America's closest allies are not immune from the trend toward fragmentation, despite the US leaders' best efforts. I mean, just look at what happened at the recent Camp David summit. Media outlets were shouting a new Cold War, but the countries that participated had different interests in mind. South Korea's main focus remains North Korea. The intelligence sharing agreements and nuclear consultations announced after the summit were much about signaling their resolve to push back against North Korea dictator Kim Jong-un's regime as they were about countering China. Japan just wants to avoid strategic escalation over Taiwan since their economy depends a lot on trade with China. I mean, just think of all the semiconductor related technology that flows between those two. And both South Korea and Japan are unhappy with the way that America is pursuing its de-risking strategy. Perhaps the biggest surprise last week was the BRICS announcement that 6 countries, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, they would become full-fledged members by the beginning of next year. Now, I don't think that China really believes that countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE will actually join it in a bona fide anti-Western bloc. Nope. China's goals are a lot more subtle. Joining the BRICS increases countries' freedom of action. So, for example, by increasing access to alternative sourcing of financing or eventually providing a genuine alternative to the United States dollar for trade, investment, and reserves. And so this means a world in which countries are not dependent on the West, but they're free to actually explore their other options. Now, coincidentally enough, this kind of world order serves China's interests a lot better than a narrower, more loyal pro-China alliance ever could. This would basically mean a world in which the superpowers, i.e. the United States and its allies, lack sufficient economic, military, or ideological clout in order to force the rest of the world, and particularly the increasingly confident middle powers, to pick a side. From South Korea to Niger to the new BRICS members, countries can afford to advance their own goals and interests rather than pick a side and prove their loyalty to the United States or other global superpowers. So yeah, overall, there's this new logic of fragmentation in the world that we're seeing. And judging by the growth of the BRICS alliance, a lot of countries seem to find this new logic enticing. But what do you guys think?